Well, it's really radical. I mean, and I have to say the interesting thing about the crypto space, and this isn't just for law, but just in general, it changes constantly. I mean, probably a year and a half ago, most of the space was just Bitcoin, and there were people that were talking about side chains, and kind of the ethos was a Bitcoin maximalist, attitude, and it's radically changed in the past year and a half just in the space. But as far as regulation, it's also been, it's just constantly changing. When I first got into the space, it was prior to the New York Bit license, and few people thought that regulation even applied to cryptocurrency. I mean, when I would talk to, it was a very kind of a dichotomy between people that thought there is no crypto regulation at all, and we can do whatever we want to, and we don't need to worry about laws. And then there were sort of law and order types that were saying, no, this all falls under current banking and regulatory rules. And in reality, they were both kind of half right. And we've seen regulators grapple with it. We've kind of seen one of three approaches. Either they've outright banned it. We've seen some countries kind of dabble with that approach where they sometimes ban it, they sometimes don't. They issue a decree that sounds like they're banning it and then they kind of backtrack it. That's been kind of the China approach. I think South Korea did that for maybe about a week last January, where they kind of banned it and then unbanned it and was never really banned. And some other countries have tried that as well. Then you have the other approach, which is the passing regulatory laws, which legalize it, but often come with a lot of restrictions. So New York famously did that with the New York Bit license I think it was summer of 2015. And I think the record speaks for itself with all these firms like Kraken leaving New York, and New York no longer being the epicenter. I mean, most of the exchanges block New York unless they have the New York Bit license. So, it's hard to figure out whether that's going to work out in the longer term. But the third approach, which I think has been the smartest approach, is a kind of wait and see approach, which whether they're creating an overt sandbox and saying we're going to allow these kind of activities and see what happens, or they're just kind of keeping hands off and seeing what happens, and then later on deciding how to craft regulations. That's what we've seen. And to me, the real interesting part of crypto that I think, especially regulators in developed countries don't see, is that you could really see the same kind of effect that we saw with the offshore industry starting in the 70s, which ultimately led to FATCA and all these other regulations of trying to bring, sort of rein that world in as it applies to US funds being held abroad, except the difference is, and also anti-money laundering compliance laws that are sort of trying to regulate those markets as well. But the difference is that cryptocurrency is a lot more fungible. For the first time, you have currencies which you can transfer without even entering the banking system. And that's really what's unique and presents challenges to regulators, is that no matter what structure you had prior to the rise of cryptocurrencies, everything had to go through the banking system. And you could create barriers to prevent people from having access to it, to keep the money in, to keep certain funds out, to keep certain people out, to keep certain countries out for anti-money laundering sanctions reasons. You don't need that system at all to transfer huge amounts of value in cryptocurrency now. And it's the beginning phases of it. We're really only sort of seeing where it's going to go. And what we have seen in the past couple of years and really in the past year, maybe even less than that, are certain offshore jurisdictions looking at ways of capitalizing on cryptocurrency and these projects, ICO laws, licensing regimes for firms that operate like exchanges and storage systems for cryptocurrency and things like that, creating systems for those kinds of companies to launch and be regulated within those jurisdictions, similar to what we saw in the late 20th century with the offshore industry, realizing we can provide, in some sense, a lot of it was tax havens, but also regulatory havens, and also ways of earning money offshore, which is not which is sort of tax exempt. And it still is thriving today in the Caribbean and offshore jurisdictions like that. I don't think that regulators can use the same tools that they use to combat that. And I think that a lot of the time you see regulators in Europe and the United States and other developed countries think about this as if it's something that can be contained. An interesting analogy is online gambling. You know, a lot of countries felt online gambling should be illegal. Gambling's illegal. It's a bane on society. I mean, you can argue. It depends on your approach to politics. If you're more of a libertarian, you might say, no, let it happen. If you're more of an authoritarian, you might say, no, this is bad, we should stop it. But the point is that the efforts that countries put forth to make it illegal just led to kind of a game of moving from jurisdiction to jurisdiction to the point where even though these gambling companies work within the existing banking system, they effectively were able to continue existing whether people liked it or not. Cryptocurrencies they don't even necessarily need to rely on the banking system. Now, obviously there's huge advantages to it, and I think every cryptocurrency company that exists wants to be integrated in it, and I think certainly there's a lot of power in using the financial system to allow cryptocurrency projects in, and that seems to be what OECD and other groups are doing. You know, it's more of a game of whack-a-mole than I think that financial regulators have ever encountered, and you're really only seeing the beginning of it.